The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's ESSA Update webinar. We appreciate your joining us today. Before we start the program, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items. I know there's going to be a lot of questions because ESSA is a hot and unknown topic, but we are going to leave some time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. Go ahead and send in your questions as they come up for you, and we'll put them in the queue to be answered. To send a question, simply click on the Questions tab on your control panel, type your question into the top box, and then click on the Send button. I'll receive it, and as I said, I'll put it in line to be answered during the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please use that same question feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be providing you with a recording of the webinar and a copy of the PowerPoint slides, so keep an eye on your inbox for a link to those later today or tomorrow. We'll also post them on the Agile website, which is at agile-ed.com. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Steve Rowley and Dr. Julie Carter. Steve is CEO and founder of Acumen Partners, LLC. He is a high-performing professional with extensive experience in business management, organizational turnaround, and revitalization, new market penetration, and strategic product lifecycle management. Steve is an expert in getting companies to drive results with a consistent focus on 4 key principles: organizational vision, customer-centric market approach, continual improvement of operational practices, and an intense focus on product excellence. Steve also proactively meets challenges by empowering proven individuals and building competent teams. Steve is joined today by Dr. Julie Carter, who is co-founder and CEO of GrayEd. Julie is passionate about impacting the classroom through effective implementations of technology. Her background in education began as a classroom teacher and media specialist before she became the Executive Director of Technology for Minnetonka Public Schools in Minnesota. There, she oversaw one of the best one-to-one computing efforts in the country and was recognized by the Apple Distinguished Educator Program and the National School Board Association. Julie was named as Tech and Learning's Leader of the Year in 2010 for her innovative use of technology and is one of 20 to watch by the National School Board Association, also in 2010. Today, Julie works with both school districts and education technology companies to ensure that teachers and students have access to the best educational technology products possible in order to learn and thrive. We're thrilled to have Steve and Julie with us today. As I said, we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and hand the program over to them.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne. Let's go ahead and start kind of picking up where we had our last webinar meeting, and that is this transition from No Child Left Behind that began to ESSA that began last December. At this point, as of October 1st, the legislative process is moving slowly. So we were, according to the original schedule that's here before you, we were expecting on October 15th to receive the rules and regs, the actual guiding principles of how to implement ESSA. The schools were supposed to have that on October 15th. That does not appear as a realistic schedule at this point. What we're seeing is that in lieu of providing those rules and regs on time, that the Department of Education has been releasing what's called non-regulatory guidance documents in a timely way so that schools and school districts, state governments, as we'll talk about here in a moment, can begin planning their accountability plans and setting their transition plans into ESSA along with this school year. So we'll be discussing a little bit more about these non-regulatory guidance documents shortly, but the rules and regs that needed to come out in October, it does not look like is actually going to happen. So as we've highlighted here on this document, right now we're looking for those rules to be enacted. The state accountability plans are being written by each individual state. The deadline for the submission of those plans remains unchanged, meaning that the states have to submit back to the Department of Education and the peer review process by the end of this year their state plans for accountability governing the 2017-2018 school year. this 1 year of transition now has begun. Students are in the classroom, and states are actually in the process of writing those. To my knowledge, I was just asked earlier today, how many of those plans have actually been written and been submitted. We've only actually seen 5 that were early bird transmissions or releases of plans, early drafts. Rumor has it that there's 7. We've not been able to find 7 plans. So we've read 5 early plans. They are each individualized, so it was not reading a carbon copy from each state to each state. And I would imagine that when we see activity at the state level, that's going to come pretty quickly. So I think they're going to come in quite a rush. We do know that there has been communication on state boards communicating with each other in terms of aligning the plans, and one of the ways that we know that was confirming those who've utilized these non-regulatory guidance documents. So right now, what we're looking at is a market. The transition year for ESSA is in full sway. The rules and regs are looking probably at best to come out sometime in early to mid-November. The states are still holding to having to submit their accountability plans by the 1st of next year, and by spend down of next year, they'll be using the last of the No Child Left Behind monies that are available to them, and everything forward from that period for the 4 years that follow will be governed by ESSA. So that's really what we're going to focus on, is one of the major trends that's showing in these guidance documents and what has come out from the states that we've been able to review and talk with has been this unique focus on data and evidence. Let's go ahead to the next slide. All right, so this process of how, getting information into the marketplace, one of the big questions that we've received a lot over the last 2 or 3 months is how are states supposed to write plans and have them in for approval by the end of this year if the rules and regulations don't come out by October, and now we're saying November. What the Department of Education has done has been a process of leaking documents that will have the most impact on accountability. They've been giving these non-regulatory guidance documents to educators, particularly the state-level educators, but they're available to everyone, to help them drive and plan. So in July, they received a release that indicated there was going to be heightened scrutiny on the use of data reporting and accountability as each state is writing their accountability plans, just so that everybody on the call is aware of what I'm talking about. As ESSA was enacted in December, the law took effect immediately, and it has a number of very deep-level changes, fundamental changes to the way that the federal government funds education in our country. One of those changes is the accountability measures that were previously spread among different title funds, Title I, Title II, Title III, have been consolidated. And the actual tracking of accountability performance for each school district is now, the responsibility for that is happening at the state level. So the states are actually responsible for receiving and distributing the money, and then holding accountable the schools and school districts for the commitments that they have made, rather than all the school districts in the country reporting to the federal government and states taking a very backseat role in that. So the states have stepped up. They have received a lot more control or persuasion over the accountability. A lot of the accountabilities have been consolidated under Title I, and that was another big question. If the accountabilities are so focused on Title I funds, what happens to Title II, Title III, Title IV? And so we'll talk about that here in a moment. In July, they were prepared with this non-regulatory document that indicated there's going to be heightened data reporting and accountability, so make sure that your plans are moving forward in compliance to that. Beginning of September, there was a release that indicated that title funds, the way that they made sure that federal funds were not being used to supplant local funds, was previously governed by the federal government. Now it's being pushed to the states, and they've been given some very strict guidelines on how they're going to have to account for that. Essentially, what they're going to be watching for is that school districts have a parity in the amount of money that the state and local governments are raising or contributing to the education of their local schools or children. So without federal money, they'll be looking at what's the per pupil spend at schools across the state and making sure that the level of spend is appropriate. And then they will use the federal money to supplement those schools that have the highest need or risk. So one of the frustrations I know of the last couple of years with No Child Left Behind, NCLB, was that the Title I schools were no longer quite as attractive as they had intended to be, because the states had defunded starting in 2008 and 2009. They had defunded a number of schools, and Title I was used to supplant, and they kind of found the loopholes that allowed them to remove money from some schools and fill that hole with Title I, making the money stretch further. That loophole has been closed, so the Title I money will actually be utilized to purchase more and extend the buying power of those schools more. So if you're a company that focuses on title money, this should make you very happy. On the 16th, we received, again, a non-regulatory guidance document that talked about the need for evidence, the role of evidence, to evaluate the effectiveness of investments in local programs. That's a word that is coming up a lot as we look at schools right now. They're no longer talking about spending in schools. The documentation around ESSA uses this concept of investing in our schools a lot. So from a political perspective, the idea that their schools are investing in programs and they're expecting to see a return on that investment is now deeply ingrained in the language both of ESSA and in these regulatory guideline documents. And I expect to see that concept fulfilled or continued in the state plans as they become available. And this idea that there's got to be evidence that something was effective and was used appropriately, that's going to be where there's a lot of major conversation in the next year to 2 years. We'll talk about that more in a moment. On the 19th, we received more information on how federal funds were going to be used to extend the impact of school-wide reform. On the 23rd, a similar set of statements. Title III ELL accountabilities were shifted to Title I, but money is still being allocated out of Title III for schools that have ELL students. So the way that money can be spent, the accountability is going to be measured in Title I, and yet the way that money can be spent and how the mechanisms around ELL will be triggered, that document came out on the 23rd, and on the 27th we received another one that indicated that Title II, again, accountability shifted to the Title I funds and to the state accountability plans, but we're seeing how Title II. So now we have two Title I, one Title II, and one Title III document that has come forward. Title IV was essentially promised as a large funding source and then defunded. So what we just discussed covers most of the vendors in the education space. Next slide, please. So the role of effectiveness, they've given a model that has not yet been written into any of the laws, and yet it is being strongly encouraged. So we're waiting to see where this comes from. It's being sponsored by the chief state school officers, but that model is the first step in spending and gathering data is the unique identification of local needs. School districts sitting down using data to identify the needs that they may have, data that sits outside the realm of just straight student performance data. So this would be data gathered from all stakeholders, superintendent to parents and students, gathering together, looking at what the needs of the school are from multiple perspectives, and then building out what interventions, what are the new steps, where are they going to invest the state and federal money. and then prepare a tight plan for that implementation. Again, accountability is a big deal in ESSA, so the plans need to be written in such a way that after implemented, they can be evaluated. Did you achieve the progress and the impact that you were seeking for? We don't know what the final definition for the word impact is going to be. We don't know what the final measures are going to be that are allowable for data, but we do know the stakeholders range from superintendents to students and parents, and we do know that that investments made by schools and any programs within those schools have to have an impact. So let's go to the next slide. So what we really want to make sure everybody walks away from today's webinar is understanding that this role of data is deeply ingrained throughout ESSA. Right now, at present, there are 93 references made to evidence or data in the law itself. That is a much larger number than was ever mentioned in No Child Left Behind. It literally is being used, evidence is being tied to almost every set of regulations and funding mechanisms in ESSA. So for products that aren't sure how to measure your impact, if you are a hardware provider, you work in the server space or infrastructure, it's hard for you to say that your product actually had some sort of a positive impact on student performance. The rules do not say that everything has to be tied to improving student scores. So for those vendors who are working in an area where it's difficult to match to student performance, what you have to be able to do is demonstrate that you've had a positive impact on the learning environment, which is a little bit different than standardized scores. For those who are providing instructional technology or you're working in the area of instructional materials, again, you're gonna be able to demonstrate that your product may not be directly measurable in student scores only, but it has positive impact in other areas. So this is it's kind of a two-edged sword. There's an opportunity on one hand for products that have a difficult time showing individualized student impact, being able to show progress in other areas. The other side of that sword, however, means that it's got to show up in the planning of the program up front, and then it's got to be demonstrated and data be collected to show that you really did have that impact. So what's also strongly referenced in ESSA is this idea that there's a multi-year aspect to these programs. So in the past, a purchase was made, we watched it to the end of this budget cycle, July came, all faults were forgiven, we have a whole new bucket of money and we're off spending again. We might be expanding a previous pilot or we might be spending on something new. The idea that we start a new year is now being calculated differently with ESSA. There's multi-year tracking. So the concept here is looking at more of a longitudinal impact for products or services or infrastructure that's been added to a school district. So the accountability plans are calling for a tiered approach to the collection of evidence. And in that tiered approach is the idea that we know that it doesn't all happen within one calendar year. There's got to be a clear evidence of impact, and it has to be over the period of several years. Next slide. So these are not small changes in how people are receiving or spending the money or how their jobs are being measured and evaluated. Every stakeholder in the process of education is being impacted by this change in the law. A lot of educators are still waiting to understand, how is ESSA going to impact my future? So in the communications that we've had, we'll share more about that in a few minutes. A lot of the educators are caught up in, I know ESSA is important, I've heard about it, it's coming, it's going to be here next year. We'll worry about that when we get to our spring planning. But right now, I've got to get the kids in school and get my fall launched and get our programs up and running. And they're kicking the can down the road for planning and becoming more aware of the requirements on them. They understand that there is some sort of a fundamental change in their life. They don't know what it is. When we are looking at, and during this webinar, what we're speaking about is when the change of this magnitude happens in the life of an educator, it changes the way they value different things. And all of us rely on our value proposition. What is it that we speak to? What pain points are we working with that motivates a school or an educator or an administrator to purchase or use my product? That's what allows us to determine a competitive price. It allows us to configure our marketing. It allows us to guide and direct our sales teams. It affects the training that goes into our marketing and our selling teams. So ESSA is changing the value equation for educators. They will become much more aware of that as they start the planning process. When they read those state plans, come January 1, they know what their state is planning to do, and they've got a limited amount of time next spring in their planning sequence. The pain points are going to become very real, and as vendors, we're going to have to speak to those new pain points in the coming months. So as we get into January, February, March, that's when we're going to be dealing with the pain points that are related to ESSA. If we have data-related issues with our product, if we aren't able to meet the new requirements in terms of data of effectiveness, we're going to have a much more difficult time selling in this spring period. Next slide, please. So Julie has tremendous expertise in this area of the use of data, the role of technology, and the play of ESSA relative to school districts. So I'll turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. This is just such an interesting conversation, especially coming off of the EdNet conference last week, and to hear both school side and vendor side talking about the true impacts this has. And as Steve mentioned, as schools are thinking about their first order of business right now is what's happening in the 16-17 school year, getting their students up and running, getting their programs off the ground. And so as this becomes a topic of conversation for them a little bit further down the road, simply because of where their focus is, it really turns up the need for vendors to understand the impact it has on all of us. And so one of the things we know is that for almost all of us, our products are related to technology in one way or another. Steve alluded to this earlier in thinking about vendors who struggle with, if my technology is not a direct student impact, how do I look at other factors impacting the learning environment itself? Well, also for vendors who are actually looking at their products, very few of us are actually non-technology based at all. No impact or no reliance on the presence of technology. So for those that may be, we know that the input and the collection of information that will be required in collecting the information to contribute towards evidence is not going to be done on paper. So to continue to prove and provide your value, we're making sure that technology stays a part of your conversations as well. So we know that technology is heavily present in our environments as vendors and as educators in schools. But as we look at what EdTech vendors assume, in our conversations, we're at about 93% of vendors assuming that the tech infrastructure is in place in schools. So whether that's a full, robust infrastructure, capacity and personnel to have the sophistication and maturity to support and implement the solutions, we know there's a disconnect here. And as we talked earlier about the importance of a needs assessment and really being able to identify from stakeholders the other components that are present within our environment, this is a major one for EdTech vendors, because the more you understand and know about the environments your products are going into, the better you can close this gap of making assumptions that your products will work based on your belief that the right structures are in place in order for the implementations to be carried out well. Additionally, for schools are really acknowledging significant hurdles and challenges within their own infrastructure. So looking at impacts around funding, planning, resources. For schools, they're still grappling with some of these pieces. So the more that they can do this needs assessment, collection of data from their key stakeholders to understand their environment, the easier they can identify those gaps and pain points and include in their plans ways to address these moving forward. So looking at the two parties together, more important than ever, schools and vendors need to rely on one another. As we're thinking about the need for successful implementation, this is really a shared responsibility here. So we're connected more than ever. Schools and vendors really looking at accountability more than ever before. So making sure that the school and the vendor actually agree on the value delivered is something that you can work on together in being able to talk about the needed impact and evidence of your product, the environment that your product is going into, and to understand the best fit or right fit scenarios for your product implementations. Moving to the next slide, as we look at the tiers of evidence here, ESSA has introduced these tiers of evidence, and these are very familiar to many of us from I3. And the major difference in looking at the level of evidence needed under No Child Left Behind is that we knew the requirements were really about being related and grounded in best practices and research. But the best practices didn't necessarily exist at the time, and the law really failed to keep up with the progress of the research community. So evidence under ESSA, being able to look at those tiers from I3, which at the time were tier 1, 2, and 3, what's new to the table is tier 4. There was this loophole that existed before where vendors could sit at kind of tier 3, where you could have this, well, grounded in research, new to the market, we're still developing, we have some promising information, but they pulled that out, created its own tier at tier 4 to be grounded in research, which means you're pilot eligible, new to the market. It's the category intended just for new programs only. So we can't sit at the bottom. We've got to move up into the tiers. So tier 4 is a brand new introduction under ESSA specific to these pieces. Looking at the other tiers here, what we know is that tier 3 is promising evidence. So I'm study eligible for my product. Before somebody can look at purchasing me, we need to be able to demonstrate that there's at least early indications that they'll experience similar results. So we're talking about promising evidence from at least one correlation study with pretests. Moving beyond tier 3 into tier 2, now we begin to expand. So we think about starting small with the classroom, expanding into some more classrooms to make this, to kind of structure that capacity a little bit bigger here. Now we're into moderate evidence. So we're continuing to use it, consideration for expansion throughout my school, but now the evidence can come from quasi-experimental studies. So here we're looking at the use of student data with large and quantitative methods. Expanding beyond tier 2 in order to get to tier 1 and have full deployment eligibility, so looking at a district-wide deployment. This is highly dependent on evidence that it will work across all environments and implementations. So now we're talking about a statistically significant effect on student outcomes from at least one experimental study. Now what's very important to understand here is that a vendor can be called upon to provide evidence of their tiers, and if there's sufficient rigorous evidence, you do not have to start at tier 3 as a school with a product. You can start with a larger expansion or deployment if the vendor can provide the evidence necessary to show sufficient rigor. So very, very important to know that that is an opportunity that exists. If we were to look at evidence under No Child Left Behind and those requirements, that would fit pretty squarely at the bottom here in tier 4. So this is a major change for vendors to understand that the evidence that they have been providing under compliance with NCLB is not going to hit these higher tiers of evidence. And so we need to be looking at our data and understanding what changes need to be made. Looking at the next slide, what that means for us as vendors is understanding that research and data that you have. First and foremost, you've got to determine the rigor. What are the steps you need to take based on the data that you have? So what is the evidence that you have to date? What have you been able to put together, collect as an organization? What do you have from pilots that have gone out in the field? If you do not have scientifically controlled studies, you need to get one. If you don't have a broad sampling of quantitative data to demonstrate effectiveness, you need to get it. So understanding the evidence, collecting the information that you have, and then you need to align it to the tiers. So pulling all that information together, and if you flip back a slide, Suzanne, pulling that information together and sitting down and being able to correlate it here to the tiers. Where do you fit in? Which one of these tiers hits where you're at? And how do we work to get you to the next tier? What's the information you need? How do we put that together? Go ahead and flip back to the current slide again, Suzanne, thank you. And so taking that information and being able to say, all right, now I understand where are my gaps, what is it I need to do because I've got to pull my pilots together. You need a plan to close those gaps very soon because we know 16, 17 is our year to do this so that when schools start having this conversation on a grander scale, start really looking at products and services for the next calendar year, or excuse me, the next school year, you have this information ready to go. So that the tier 2, tier 3 levels, you need to establish active pilots. So if you're in any of those 4, 3, or 2 levels, getting those pilots going so that people can and schools can be looking at justifying spending for your products. Suzanne, go ahead and move to the next slide, please.
All right, so just building on what Julie has mentioned here, understanding where your product has evidence of impact, evidence of significant improvement, and being able to define that in a way that connects with your buyers. As we are creating our step forward, think of the money that's being spent. So when I get at a loss or I'm not sure what to do, I look at the money trail. The No Child Left Behind era is coming to an end. This is the last year of transition. So they're beginning to look at ESSA. They're finishing up their No Child Left Behind. As they get into this upcoming spend down, this will be the last opportunity. So if you, as a vendor, have counted on district purchases across multiple sites or multiple, you're licensing your product or you're providing a hard good to a district-wide, this is the time to understand this might be the last year that you're going to qualify for a major transaction like that. And it is the time for you to dig in and figure out as you're walking in and you've got your sure money this upcoming spring in spend down that the districts are going to be looking for what happens next year. So they're spending their spring money moving into an ESSA. They're going to be evaluating from a perspective of, do I need to start building data? Do I need to go to a different product that has better data or will help me be accountable for the new plan? So using an example of somebody who provides hardware equipment and has been rotating equipment out, every couple of years or selling new servers to a large urban district, they will need to be able to demonstrate that their piece of the infrastructure has been servicing the district well in order for the district to continue to spend at a minimum the federal money. And most likely there'll be this carryover into the state funds. That hardware provider is going to need to make sure that they understand how they're going to be measured by the district as successful And if they have data themselves that demonstrates that they have looked at this problem and are able to consolidate or put together something that qualifies for Tier 2 or Tier 1 in a controlled study, this is how we performed. Here's our documented uptime, here's our documented service rate. That information is all going to be critical for school districts. One of the other areas I was asked, what if I was to develop a new product, what would the hot product be? Well, a lot of it's going to be built around helping school districts understand the data. A lot of individuals have not dealt with disaggregating information or aggregating information or measuring what's the difference between scientific rigorous data versus soft data. And being able to teach or present that at an administrator or a teacher level, that's a great place to be right now because the data is becoming the center of their life. This slide that we're looking at talks a little bit more about this concept of a value proposition. The speed at which we changed from No Child Left Behind from the previous ESSA law was slow. We had 3 to 4 years of transition time to prepare and to shift our market or to wind up what we were doing and move into new places. We don't have that transition luxury here with ESSA. This time around, we have this year as our transition. So what's vital for this fall is understanding how your product connects to the users in the school district and connects to the people who have control over spending. And this is where we look at the pains and the gains. If your teachers love your product, but you haven't demonstrated that it improves their instruction in the classroom, the buyer at the district level is going to be scrutinizing that differently. Accountability has shifted, and now it's being looked at more from the whole student perspective than just from whether or not I delivered a day of training. So what it contributed is going to be much more important to the person spending, regardless of how the teacher feels about the training. So next slide, please. So the concept that Julie brought up a few minutes ago needs to be ingrained in your thinking for this fall and winter as you move into the selling season. As you finish up 2016, and many of you are finishing your fiscal year, you're in Q4, and you're starting to look at what your plans are for Q1 of next year, you need to gather your team and do some brainstorming, understanding how is ESSA going to impact our team. Why do people like our product? Why do they buy? Where do we have competitive points that others might use to move into our marketplace? That brainstorming process needs to be taking place now. You need to be talking to your market leaders, to your product leaders, to your customers more than anything. Why is it you buy our product? What is it that you like about us? What don't you like about us? Those vulnerabilities will become much more critical as they start to evaluate their purchases next year. So this is the time to be doing that. Sitting down and reconceptualizing who you are from a market perspective is important. It may be that these changes favor your position right now. It may be that you are a smaller vendor that is progressive in your thought, that you've been tracking data and you have a much better foothold. This may be a great opportunity for you to step forward and for your marketing and district people to speak around the level of evidence that you have, that you are already a Tier 2 or a Tier 1, you're ready to demonstrate multi-year impact. There are others who have a lot of anecdotal information about their products but aren't able to tell a multi-year story, aren't able to call forward data. This is where you're going to have to get conceptually aligned with your team. How are we going to get in and make this happen so that going forward in the ESSA era, we are prepared to carry the line correctly. This is also the time for your sales and marketing teams to step forward. Once this brainstorming's taken place and you've established either we are great, we're fine, we line well with the market where it's going, or while we have some liability here, we need to reconceptualize and decide who we're going to be in our next iteration. Once that's done, then you need to take and work with your marketing and your selling teams. There will be a pretty clear transition in message. As you finish up Q4, we don't have a period of time here where the schools are doing a lot of planning for next year. Traditionally, the fall is where we build our pipelines. It's when sales reps are taking our products, we're introducing them to the schools, we're extending new pilots, we're penetrating and building our pipeline. We're closing business, but we are really looking at where are we going to be for the next year. The sales and marketing teams need to be prepared for the data level and the accountability questions that will come January through June of next year. What does this ESSA mean? How does this help? How can you help us get ready for ESSA? We postponed being prepared, and now we need help from the vendors to get there. That's going to be a big push this upcoming spring. Once your sales and your marketing teams have been transitioned, the winter sales meeting is a great time to work with your teams, but for many teams, this is not enough time. A 3-day event or a 5-day event at the end of December or the first couple of weeks of January will not be enough time to help them be versed in the issues around ESSA. So making sure that you give yourself run time to prepare your team is important. And then take to market whatever you're preparing now for the ESSA period of time. Understand you're moving in January. That's your go-to-market time frame. You start this new message in January, and you work to the end of fiscal year 2016, and you begin the next fiscal year 2017-18 starting in July. I think there's one more slide. Right. So as we look at this timeline again, we are right where the ESSA rules are beginning to be enacted. While we don't have the hard documents, we do have these non-regulatory guidelines, which essentially are being released by the DOE to tell schools and districts these are the things to start your changes. Get thinking about these issues because this is where the law and the rules and the regulations are going. That is the DOE's answer to we might be late on the release of our final rules and regulations. So by all means, understand these are the areas that we see as most critical for you to get your arms around. The state accountability plans are going to be available and submitted so far by January. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work going on to connect states with where these guidelines are falling as they're being reviewed and prepared for release. It's got to go through the budget department, the DOE, Congress has got to approve them before they can be released. And in an election year, who knows what politics are taking on, going on behind the scenes here. Full ESSA implementation takes place in July of next year. So when they go to bed at June 30, it's over. And from July 1 forward, they are living in an ESSA time frame. So this is the only time that you have left to get prepared for living during an ESSA, a data-related and an evidence-centric market time. So we've got a number of elements as we wrap up. I'll let you know we've got several tools that are available upon request after the webinar. One of those is to help you establish how is your value proposition impacted by the changes. Hopefully the things that you've heard, the things that you're able to go out and research yourself with these guidance pieces. I know there's great information on the DOE website. EdWeek has done a great job of speaking to these issues. So there's a lot of information around. Go out and research your value proposition and understand how does the new law impact that. There's another worksheet or tool that is available through Julie that will help you evaluate is the evidence that you have sufficiently rigorous for the upcoming market. So you'll be able to sit down and take a look at what you have and answer some questions about the level of rigor and understand, are we a tier 4 and what do we need to do to get to the next tier? If we're tier 4, how do we get to tier 3? If we're tier 3, what can we do to get to tier 2? We'll also have a third tool that's available upon request that will help you build a timeline of transition. We can't do everything at once as a company, so how do we take the resources we have, prioritize, and receive the biggest, bang for the buck? Where do we get the best return on our efforts? So those three tools will be available on request following this webinar. So I want to conclude at least my comments by making sure that we all understand the role of data and the role of evidence is central to this new law. We want to make sure that everybody is on the same page, that this is a new competitive space. There's going to be opportunities for individuals who are facing challenges to take up and make a difference this upcoming year. There'll be opportunity for new companies to steal market space. There's also an opportunity for established companies to protect their market space and to grab additional. So I think there's going to be a turbulent market in spring. And then in the new year, so much is going to be dependent not just upon the relationships anymore, but this idea of demonstrated impact. How can you build into your products a continual way to remind your clients or your customers that you are delivering on the promises that you've made to them? For some of us, it's easy. For others, it's very difficult because our products are behind the scenes. So being able to continually remind people of the value that you've created is a really important aspect of living in an ESSA era education market. So I just want to wrap up our comments here, and I know, Suzanne, that we wanted to have some time for questions.
Yes, we do. We have a lot of questions coming in. So the first one actually is about, you said that those materials and tools will be available upon request. Maybe we can go to the next slide and take a look at how people can request those. So you can contact Ellen or email Ellen and request those tools, and she'll be happy to get them your way. And we'll also put her information in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow with the slides and the recording of all of this great information that Steve and Julie has shared. So, guys, like I said, we have a lot of questions coming your way. From the beginning, we've had several folks ask, is there a single location where they can go to find those state accountability plans? Are those being posted on the DOE website, or is it state by state?
Yeah, it's too easy to hope that there would be one location where those could be available. No, right now it's going state by state, and no state actually has their site consistently organized. So we've actually had one instance where the state has changed where they posted the plan that they posted several months ago. So we had to go back in and find out if they'd updated, but they changed their site configuration. So right now, no, there is no central clearinghouse for that. You'll have to look state by state. We are, as an organization, collecting those and trying to stay current on those.
Okay, so as usual, it's a very hands-on job to get done.
Yep.
So with all of this evidence of accountability coming to the forefront, do features and benefits really matter as much as they used to? Or in terms of marketing and sales, is it really just going in and slapping your data on the desk?
It's hard to speak in general. Features and benefits will always be important. That's how you communicate the vision of your product. What's going to be different in these sales is that you're going to have to put some proof to the pudding. You're going to, like in an auto dealership, you're going to have your sticker in the window that says not only is the car beautiful, but it gets 38.6 miles per gallon in the city and 42 on the highway, and it's been rated 5 stars by the following companies. I mean, there's going to have to be some evidence that goes along with your connecting point. So it's not minimizing the sale. If anything, it's kind of increasing. Julie, did you see that any differently, or?
No, I think you're correct. I think from a school district perspective, that data is obviously very important to the discussion, but it's also the conversation around what makes you stand out from the other products on the market, especially in crowded markets or saturated markets for specific types of products. As a school district decision maker, I care very much about the data, but I want to understand the other components that set you apart. And oftentimes those come through in features and functions. So still an important part of the conversation. It's just adding additional, depth to those discussions beyond what you may be doing now about a very nice story or link to types of evidence that you've been using under No Child Left Behind.
Okay, so it's putting some more numbers to those success stories and case studies we've maybe traditionally done.
Absolutely.
Correct, yep.
So we may not have answers to this, but how are these tiers going to be regulated? In terms of a vendor moving through those tiers, you said you can no longer just linger in tier 4, but who's really making sure that vendors move through them, or is it just a matter of the school districts aren't going to take you on if you aren't, progressing?
That's an excellent question, and there is no vendor police, but the way the law is being written is that the accountability actually is falling on the school districts. So the people that spend the money is where the accountability lies. So they're encouraging strongly functioning in much more transparent initiatives, is what they're calling them, and programs with third parties to help evaluate and make sure that all parties to a transaction or an implementation are performing their role. So they're encouraging that they work with a university or a nonprofit organization to help evaluate and make sure that the assessment and the data that's being collected is being done well. That doesn't mean that everything that you sell is going to be part of some initiative in the district and be tracked by a third party, but that's the type of program that's being encouraged right now. And so the model was laid out as, hey, look at I3. This has been successful. This is how we want all of our products and all the money that the federal government is contributing to education. This is how we want it tracked now. And the states are building their accountability plans using that as a minimum standard. And they are, again, always follow the money trail. It's going to the states and then to the school districts. The states are holding the school districts accountable. And many things are out of a school district's level of control, and so they will be looking for you as a vendor partner to deliver on what you promise. If not, they'll find another one. And the states are going to be encouraging a lot more relationships with third parties, whether they're nonprofit or higher ed. If you're involved in a product where your gains are questionable in a particular district, think of something that's large scale, you can bet that the school district will be inviting a third party into the relationship because that'll make the state happy, and the amount of money that they have left to give to you goes down accordingly. So states with accountability plans, if you're an unreliable partner, they'll probably call in a babysitter to help evaluate and make sure that you're delivering. So the best thing to do is live up to your promises, be a great partner, be transparent, and that provides more money to be spent with you. If you're a partner that needs to be babysat because you're not a good partner, you have problems delivering, or you're not transparent in your data, they are being coached to bring in a third party to help evaluate those programs or initiatives.
So that actually leads into some other questions we've gotten, which is, you had mentioned that the evidence of success is on a district-by-district basis. So vendors are going to work with the districts to set the goals. So really, it sounds like both you as a vendor and the district potentially are going to put things in place to be measuring those. So potentially there's duplication in that effort?
It's possible that there's duplication. I mean, it is possible. Most likely, the schools, they're resource constrained right now. They're going to be resource constrained later. So the most likely scenario, one of the things that we are doing at Acumen Partners is we're polling educators on an ongoing basis to help gauge some of the pains and gains that they're feeling and to take a look at how their responsibilities are changing. And as we look at that information, there still is a lot of trust for the vendors to come forward and provide information about the success or the performance of their products. So there will not be like this immediate change. If you say that your product evaluates and gives test scores and the data is good, most likely the school district is going to build that in and say, oh, that kind of matches this accountability requirement over there, check. And there's a greater likelihood, if you have good data points and you're rigorous in your collection of the data and transparent, that they're not going to duplicate. They're going to use you as the measure, or use a third-party solution that collects data to help measure your success. So school districts are not going to try to duplicate. It's only going to happen really when they involve that third party. If a university comes in, then they will be bringing in a lot more measurement and evaluation techniques. And as a vendor, I think the strategy would be to try to minimize that as much as possible. I don't know, Julie, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think that from the school's perspective, one of the things they're looking for is that collection and measurement with a neutral tool, so that I'm not looking at a purely vendor-produced tool or diagnostic about the product. That could be one of the very important collection points as a component of the overall evidence. But what are the other indicators going on around that? So if I'm able to look at other solution-neutral tools to measure the impact in my ecosystem, in my environment, and what's happening in impacting students or the organization as a whole, that really gives me a lot more transparency around what's going on and another level of comfort, because it's a step away from a vendor-provided, produced solution for that, which isn't to say that that isn't valuable, but that should be one of other points of collection.
Okay, that sounds like a lot for people to digest, as all of this is. So we had some questions around, and I think that this probably isn't standardized, but are schools and districts going to be required to fill out a plan before they buy something that says, that outlines, here's the student data that supports it, here's, the multi-year tracking, here's clear evidence of implementation? Is there some sort of process for them to submit, here's what we want to buy, and here's how it aligns to those tiers?
That will depend on the funding source that they're looking towards. So the use of RFPs will probably increase. So the idea that they're looking for specific tools or specific types of tools, and they're going to want vendors to bring information to the table that allows them to be to make more informed decisions. That is highly likely. We've seen a trend towards that over the last few years anyway. So that is a likely occurrence, along with ESSA, that you won't be filling out an application so much as responding to we need this information. So again, being part of a relationship and being transparent early on will help you maintain your existing business and give you a chance to fill those slots. In lieu of an application type process, these accountability plans, the districts are already in large part preparing multiple reports for lots of different grant sources. So, state by state, they're hoping to streamline some of this paperwork by saying, here's our plan for the year, and here are the different programs that we're going to be utilizing. Here's the state accountability plan that I'm responsible for, and by bringing all the money in through the state, sort of streamline the reporting responsibilities for a school district, so they're not reporting to multiple state agencies and multiple federal agencies, that reporting has kind of come together. And it's actually a part of an educator's life that most vendors aren't a part of. We really don't care what they report. In the past, with No Child Left Behind, we just sold our product and we moved on. And when they were filling out their reports or whatever, we didn't care because we didn't sell to that person. And that person's now become part of the selling equation. So it isn't so much we'll fill it out or have prefab information. It's going to be a lot more of either responding to an RFP or being involved in the school district. So as they're writing their reports, we're helping supply data that's central to that. we're much more invested in the success of our programs that way as a stakeholder. Julie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're hearing over and over in several of these responses is the importance of a partnership and transparency, and that idea that we haven't always been on the same page together as, you know, schools and vendors, and that this is the opportunity, and more than the opportunity, it has to happen, that this becomes a true partnership where you are able to lead schools a little bit through this process in being able to provide this information for them, and knowing that there's a lot of unanswered questions, but there's certainly enough information for vendors to get started with what they need to do. And so I think that's just an important kind of culminating thought, is that reoccurring theme of your need as a vendor to be a true partner to the school.
Yeah, and now is the time. The time is almost run out. People have to start paying attention.
Yeah, that sequence, exactly.
Yeah. Well, we've unfortunately run out of time, speaking of time. We did have quite a few more questions come in, and we will share those with Steve and Julie, and they will likely get back with you and provide some answers and some assistance. Again, if you want to request the tools that Steve outlined, reach out to Ellen. Her number is there on the screen, 630-362-7837. Her email address is also there, and we'll put that in the follow-up email that you receive tomorrow with the recording and the slides. Thank you very much, Steve and Julie, for helping us to unpack some of this and get as much clarity as we can around what we need to be doing with ESSA and how we can be good partners to our customers and prospective customers. We appreciate everyone joining us today, and just a quick reminder that our next webinar is scheduled for November 17th. We're going to be joined by education sales expert Marshall Eubanks, and he's going to talk about how to identify the right people within the school system to target based on your product type and sales goals. He's also going to share some strategies on how to best connect with what are very increasingly busy educators, how to break through some of that clutter and get your calls answered. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks, Steve and Julie, for all that you shared with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye.